Now we are coming to the fifth section of this class in philosophy of economics, and the topic is a very famous paper by Milton Friedman, one of the best known economists of the 20th century, published in 1953. It is seen, and I think justifiably so, as the most important paper in the methodology of economics since the early 50s. You find it in every class on philosophy of economics worldwide. I think that paper is better than most economists think. I will come to the discussion of the paper. It is very useful to study this paper carefully, because even if you don't agree with Friedman, there are many topics that are really still fully alive and a vital part of current philosophy of economics.
It's called F53. It's usually called, it's so many times cited. I give you an outline now of my section here, of section 5 here. I first talk about the literature, then I present to you Friedman 1953, and then I have comments on Friedman, and that'll take us at least altogether 3 hours or so, because it's really worth it. Now, a few words on the literature. The central text of section 5 is, of course, that paper by Friedman from 1953. It appeared first in Essays in Positive Economics, Chicago, University of Chicago Press. There's a facsimile reprint in Mäki, The Methodology of Positive Economics, Reflections on the Milton Friedman Legacy. This is a whole volume with new papers on Friedman. Right? This appeared in 2009. This is 56 years after the original paper. Still a full volume collected stuff on Friedman. So if you're interested in that, there is really, this is not, there are many every year, new papers appear on Friedman, but there you find a very good collection of papers. Then I give you some supplementary texts. One is by Horstman, again, our old friend Horstman, Why Look Under the Hood, The Philosophy of Economics and Anthology. This is a paper on Friedman. And then a paper that's not so known, but I cited once, Kepler, The Genesis of Positive Economics. And then a very interesting one is by Mäki, that's the other famous philosopher of economics from Finland, reading the methodological essay in 20th century economics, a map of multiple perspectives. And he defends there the view, first of all, this is the most methodological essay in 20th century economics, and I think probably many people would agree, but there are many perspectives on that, and people really have difficulties reading that paper, and they all disagree, and some think it's a wonderful essay, other things it's real crap, it's really bad, and Friedman is such a confused mind. Anyway, we'll see what we are doing with it. And then Mäki also has a particular view than unrealistic assumptions and unnecessary confusions, rereading and rewriting F53 as a realist statement. Now, this is a really interesting title when an author says, you know, rewriting F53. You read an article and say, oh yeah, I got to rewrite that article 50 years later. I don't know, oops. Anyway, yeah. So he thinks he has to rewrite that as a realist statement. So we'll see. That's a very funny title anyway. Yeah, we may be confused about that, but we'll see that. And then there's a very important article cited, very often read everywhere, Unreal Assumptions in Economic Theory, The F-Twist Untwisted. The F-Twist is in a discussion that was led in a conference, I've forgotten which one, in United States, and Samuelson, also not a completely unknown economist, he discussed the paper, and he said that Friedman is doing in his paper the F-twist, right? The F-twist. We'll see what that is. That's about these unrealistic assumptions, and therefore it's the F-twist, and then Musgrave says we got to untwist the F-twist. So you see how literally, you know, these are almost poems what these people are writing, you know, triggered by this paper of Friedman. All right. So let's go to this paper. Now, Milton Friedman is known to all of you, I guess, 1912 to 2006. Certainly one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. I just read recently that someone said the most important economist of the first half of 20th century is Keynes, and the second half of the 20th century is Friedman. Now, these are assessments that are not that important, but certainly Friedman is one of these really important economists of the 20th century. Nobel Memorial Prize 1976. And if you look at Google citations, if you can read them, 172,000 in April, that's a lot. Right? This is really a lot. So of those economists alive, they reach something like 100. Thaler is at the moment, I think, at 120, 130,000. Fair is at 90,000. Amatera Zen is at 280,000 or so. So these are the numbers. So this is really massive, really massive. So the most important publications, of course, Capitalism and Freedom from 1962, 20,000 Google citations, which is for a single paper, really a lot. So if you look at Fair and Schmidt, for instance, seemingly the most important paper published after 99 has now something like, 9,000 citations or so. So 20,000 citations is really a lot. Okay. So then, of course, the very famous article, The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profit. That is what Friedman is famous for. This has come under heavy attack also recently. Recently, this British economist Paul Collingham was here, and he strongly attacked Friedman exactly on that. He said, if you have a company and all the company's aim is to increase profit, what do you think your employees of motivation would they have to work for you, right? Isn't it better to have what he calls an ethical company, namely a firm which has a sort of vision where you say, one of the examples from Collingham was the British chemical company that said, we want to be the best company in the world. And that makes, of course, your employees possibly better motivated than when you say, all you have to do is, that our shareholders get enough money. So anyway, so this is controversial, but of course, this was extremely influential, what Friedman did here. And then, of course, this article, Methodology of Positive Economics, generally seen as the most important methodological article of post-war economics, 6,500 Google citations. This is for a methodological article really immensely high. So this is an important article, and I will try to convince you that the article is even much better than most people think it is. And it's really interesting, and you can really learn a lot about economics by reading this article. You don't have to agree, but you can learn a lot. Now, the absolute standard view of Friedman's paper is what is called Friedman's instrumentalism. You find that in many cases, and probably you've heard it also in lectures, if someone referred to Friedman, namely, this is in Mäki's word, even outrageously unrealistic assumptions are just fine in economics, insofar as the theory or model involving them performs well in predicting phenomena of interest. Is that something, who has never heard anything of Friedman? No, nobody, but does that sound familiar to you, association with Friedman? You've heard something similar? Some of you have, some of you, okay, whatever. So, but this is really the standard view. Now, instrumentalism, Friedman's instrumentalism, this comes under this label, and instrumentalism means that hypotheses are just instruments to produce predictions and not truthful representations of reality. That's what instrumentalism means, right? So whenever you have instrumentalism in philosophy, say a physicist says, I'm an instrumentalist, then he means theories are only there to predict phenomena, but don't believe what the theories themselves say, right? That's unimportant. They are just instruments that produce predictions. Therefore, a theory, a hypothesis, a model is just an instrument and nothing more. It's not a truthful or approximately truthful representation of reality. It's just an instrument, nothing more. So it's a very modest stance regarding the worth of scientific knowledge or scientific theories. They're just instruments. They can't do more. They can't tell you the truth about the world, but they give you predictions about the world. Okay. Now, among methodologists and philosophy of economics, F53 is highly contested until today. There are still, as I said, papers appearing. It's incredible. I mean, this is now from 53. This is really an old paper. Anyway, so many different interpretations of F53 exist, especially concerning this question, instrumentalism versus realism. You saw the paper by Mäki, who says, yeah, we've got to rewrite reread and rewrite. Okay, reread and rewrite. Okay, go ahead. As a realist paper, right? Everyone else says, no, it's instrumentalist. So they can't even get clarity about that. This is also amazing. Okay, and there are different opinions on the relation of F53 to Popper. And I will discuss all of that, of course. Here's the outline of the article. Also, that's worth reading the outline of the article, because if you read the article without getting an idea what the architectonic or the structure of the article is, you don't get it. The article is quite complicated because he's got many examples and he compresses them then in 3 sentences, and then you get lost in all of that stuff. And then you lose the bigger line. So he starts with the relation between positive and normative economics. I talked about that already in one of the first sections. Then he talks about positive economics, right? Then he asks the question, can a hypothesis be tested by the realism of its assumptions, right? So hypotheses and realistic assumptions belongs, of course, to positive economics. So he starts with the whole field of economics, then he says, I cut out one piece here, namely positive economics, and then I cut out one piece within positive economics, namely hypotheses that have some sort of assumptions. And then he asks the question, can they be tested by the realism of its assumptions? Very often when such a question comes in the title, the answer is no, right? Therefore you ask the question. Anyway, but that's not... Then he says, okay, then he discusses that. And then apparently he goes to the next section, the significance and role of the assumptions of a theory. So he's got some results apparently in the 3rd section where he says, yeah, can it be tested, yes or no? And then he answers that question, and then he gives you a larger story apparently. What is the significance and role of the assumptions of a theory? And please note, assumptions is with scare quotes, right? Very important. I come back to it, believe me. All right? Oops, that was bad. Here we are again. So, and then he comes to some implications for economic issues. And then you learn, whoops, it seems to be that he did not discuss economic issues in these 3 and 4, because then only there he comes to the economic issues. So, and this is what happens there. The discussion in 3 and 4 are rather abstract with no particular relationship to economics. And the particular relationship to economics is then established in section 5. Many people then stay in the discussion, stay already with much of the stuff in 3 and 4 and don't get what's happening in 5. And if you don't get what's happening in 5, I think you do not understand what's going on in that whole paper. Okay, and then the conclusions in the end. So this is a very, very clear line what's going on there, right? He starts with the big economics as a whole, positive, normative, then to positive, and then he comes to these questions about these assumptions. They seem to be the really interesting stuff. In the second, in 4 assumptions, even with scare quotes, and then come the more particular, specific implications for economic issues. All right, that's the big line. So let's start. So as always, I present to you now the article, and then later I make comments. Now, what Friedman says there in this relation between positive and normative economics, for which we are fairly well prepared, is that results of positive economics are often rejected because they don't fit ideas about normative economics. But positive economics is independent of any ethical position. So what he says is that if you, for normative reasons, say policies you like or dislike, if you reject positive economics, you make a mistake, right? And this is exactly what I said when I discussed positive and normative. Your ideas, what should be the case, normative, what sort of, say, equality or whatever, that must not influence the results of positive economics, of positive science. It's 2 independent things, right? This is what he says. And now he says what the task of positive economics is: a system of generalizations to make correct predictions about the consequences of any changes in circumstances. In my exposition at the beginning about the relationship, this is just these if-then connections that tell you if you do this and that, then that and that will happen. And this is, of course, what you need for policy advice, that you say, well, tell me what you want, and I tell you what sort of regularities you should use. And then you can, according to the side effects, you can choose what is bad. So that's what positive economics is supposed to do. And he claims, and this is perhaps surprising, positive economics is an objective science as the physical sciences. So he claims, look, there's no fundamental difference between physics and economics. Right? And of course, if he's right, then of course every economist say, wow, we made it, right? Finally, we did it. But of course, we want to see an argument. How can you really argue that, or is that just a fantasy? Normative economics and what he calls the art of economics, meaning, of course, the artful application of economics to political matters, depends on it. So normative there, dependent, and positive economics is the basis, and this is how I explained it to you also in the beginning. Of course, I was informed about that, and I think he's just right here. Now, this is an interesting point that many people overlook, that differences about economic policy derive mostly from different predictions, not from different values. This is a lecture that I had learned myself without Friedman, but it was very hard to learn, but it's extremely important to understand that. I give you the examples from Friedman. He says, different opinions about minimum wage, trade unions, etc. So when people support or oppose minimal wage, what Friedman says is it's less their differences in norms and values. That's not the case. But it's the question, what is the effect of minimum wage, especially concerning jobs, right? And the difference between most people when they argue about minimum wage is not because they have different values. Say, one party is happy to have many jobs and full employment and so on, and the other not, so they don't value the same sort of thing. No, Friedman says, no, they value the same things typically, but they have different positive ideas what the effect of minimal wage is. I can give you an example where I learned it, and it took me a really long time to understand that. This was the debate a few decades ago in Switzerland about nuclear power. And there you had, of course, very strongly on the left, so to speak, or green, you had these against nuclear power, and then you have those people from the right or conservative or business who were pro-nuclear power. And the perception, especially from the left, was that these are, of course, bad capitalists, and they don't care about human beings and all of that. So the point simply is a different one, was a different one. It's much less this, but it's really the question, what are the effects of nuclear power? And that's completely independent of normative evaluations. The effects are, and especially, what is the effect of nuclear power in comparison to other possibilities? And there are some people on the side of the nuclear power proponents said, look, concerning CO2 and many other aspects, nuclear power is just the best option. The other options are not as good. Whether that's right or not is a different question. But it was a difference there, and they said, yes, and security is safety is no problem. We can handle it. Whether they're right or not, different question. And the others said, no, safety, it doesn't work, and, terrorist attacks, and so on. So the question was really about positive things. But when you look at the surface, at the controversy, then it looks as if different values were involved. And this is the same in many, many cases in political discussions. And then you think, usually because your own values are the good values of a good human being, then you think the others are really beasts and morally and completely immoral subjects, greedy and capitalists or whatever, or socialists or terrorists or whatever. So this is the easy way. But the point is, if you have such controversies, look what is the core at the descriptive level. Because there, in principle, we know how to discuss. We just got to find out how it is, right? And this is what Friedman says, and I think he's absolutely right. This is a very important point, and therefore he says possible consensus on economic policy thus depends much more on progress of positive economics than on progress of normative economics. And I think he's absolutely right. This is a very important message. So people do have different interests. But what he's simply saying is here that it depends more on progress of positive economics. So that the tendency to undervalue the difference in the descriptive part, that is his point. That's not an absolute statement. And there are many times that interest, different values, blah, 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 also play a role. So if you say, if you have an interest in world peace, and this is confronted then with an interest love in your home country. And then people really do have different interests. For some of them, their love, their home country is more important and more, more valuable, that they have this feeling of being home, whereas others have a more international view and think in terms of humankind. So whether you think in terms of Switzerland or in terms of Europe or in terms of the world, there are real differences, value differences between human beings. But all he's saying, and this is also my experience, that in many cases one underestimates the difference, that's just different fact judgments. What will be the effect of this or that? So this is what he's saying. Okay. So it's careful. I mean, this is not it depends much more on progress of positive economics than anything else. So what he did there then, of course, with this introduction is, look, this is now why I'm discussing positive economics, that we get out of this first section. This is more important than anything else, and here we are at positive economics. So what you see is there is really a line in this paper, and that line we want to follow. But now let us continue here. And we come now to this section, Positive Economics. Remember, the title of Friedman's paper is The Methodology of Positive Economics. This is his subject. And she introduced it in the way by looking at the whole of economics. I don't know whether econometrics in 53 was already an established subdiscipline. He has the art of economics there as well. And then he shows, look, at the core of economics is really positive economics. And now I talk about the methodology of positive economics. So what is he doing? He really does start from scratch by talking first about what is the overall goal of science. And he's got the idea here. The ultimate goal of a science is a theory that yields predictions about phenomena not yet observed. This is what he claims. Now, I can tell you that there is a long discussion about the goals of science in general. And again, most scientists aren't aware how many different goals there are that are being discussed. And this is a rather narrow view to say it's all about predictions of phenomena not yet. Many physicists say the same. I once, I gave a talk there, and their physicists said, yeah, of course, it's predictions, blah, blah, blah. And then I said, what about paleontology? I mean, everything is in the past, and other fields. And also, even if you go to economics, so the article, I think I mentioned it in the general discussion of general philosophy of science by Lionel Robbins. I mean, really a world-class economist. And he says economics is much less about predictions than about understanding. Right? He says, no, concerning predictions, we economists are very bad. But what we are good at is understanding economic phenomena. And understanding and prediction is really different stuff. So this is highly controversial. So, but anyway, this is just, and as I said, I mean, most scientists, at least those I encountered, when they then very simply said what the goal of science is, very self-confidently, didn't see that there are many people of the same scientific caliber than them having a different idea, though, whether it's prediction. And for the day-to-day business of science, it doesn't make a difference. So people can argue, then scientists typically argue over that over a beer, right? And after 5 or after 9, rather, in the evening when they still have a drink somewhere. But this is not part of every day, so it doesn't really make a difference what scientists say there, because it's not interested, not important anyway. So anyway, he says it's about predictions of phenomena. Now and then he says, what is theory? In economics, of course. Theory is a complex intermixture, he says, of two elements, a language and a body of substantive hypotheses. So in order to have hypotheses, of course, you need concepts to articulate them. So he says we've got a language and a body of substantive hypotheses. So first of all, the language. And there he says it's a set of tautologies. And when you read that first, you say, what the hell is he talking about? Because a tautology is all red things are red, right? All dead things are dead, or all whatever. So you say, what? Well, this is the way people talked in the 50s about definitions. Definitions were called tautologies, right? Because on both sides of a definition is the same thing, in other words. That's what a definition is all about, right? You define a term, and the left-hand side defines what on the right-hand side or the other way around. So this is what he means. So if you don't understand, a set of tautologies, and then he said that serve as a filing system. Already that is somewhat strange. A filing system, how should that work? And he says it's exhaustive with headings and subheadings. Now, this sounds rather like a taxonomy, right? Where you have concepts and then you have subconcepts and subconcepts. That's titles and subtitles, similar to a taxonomy. And then you say, whoops, I don't really understand what's going on. Now, he gives an example. He speaks about supply and demand, and there are various factors then classified as affecting either supply or demand, for example, in final markets for consumer goods. So what he thinks here is, I think, that you say the existence of complements or the existence of substitutes. This is something that affects, of course, the demand side. And for the supply side, probably he would say something, I guess, like factors of production. Right, the availability, and so you classify according to this difference between supply and demand. You classify various factors as relevant, affecting either supply and demand. And this is what he thinks, and this is the concepts that you need, plus this ordering, a filing system that you need in order then, this is only an example, once you speak about consumer goods, you have theories about a hypothesis about consumer goods, you've got to have these concepts in place, and this is the language that is one part of the theory. And he says this is the distinction between supply and demand is not useful for all situations. For instance, in speculative markets regarding short-term fluctuations, then the distinction between supply and demand doesn't work. It's not informative if you have these short-term, strong fluctuations in the financial speculative market. Then it's not a question where you can analyze what's happening there in terms of supply and demand. There, the distinction is not useful, and this is what Friedman does in all the paper absolutely consistently. All what you're doing in economics is relative to problem situations. You never get completely overarching stuff. It's always relative. The models and the vocabulary is always relative to certain problem situations. We'll see that it's an extremely important point he's making there. So this is the language that you get. So you get a language, not just a set of definitions, but really already an ordered set with subheadings and something what is relevant, what is not. And then you can form hypotheses, a theory. And then he says, therefore, a theory is a body of substantive hypotheses intended to explain a certain class of phenomena. Again, you have here relative to a certain class of phenomena. So all the theories that Friedman is discussing are not universal theories, but they are all applied to certain classes of phenomena. That's different in physics, because there you have universal theories. But here, implicitly, Friedman says that doesn't exist in economics. It's always relative to certain classes, larger or smaller, but never that you can speak with one theory about all phenomena altogether. This is not available. At least not this was his view in 1953. And now the point is, he says, the only relevant test of these substantive hypotheses, the only relevant test is the comparison of its prediction with experience. And he's going to argue that later. So he says he doesn't say anything about how to test this vocabulary, but he says what you can do is you have this body of substantive hypotheses, and the only relevant is the test of these predictions with experience. And that is, of course, in accordance with what he claimed to be the goal of science, namely predictions, right? So this fits. If he said, well, the goal is deep explanations of phenomena, then you need a different test here. I mean, you would have to say, well, does this hypothesis deliver deep explanations, right? So this is coherent here. He says, yes, predictions is the goal, and therefore the test of these hypotheses is by predictions, and this will be argued in great detail how this is supposed to work. Now and then he makes what many scientists, that's usually the case, that when scientists speak about predictions, they do not mean predictions about the future, but predictions may be retrodictions that must only not be known about the forecaster. So for instance, when you test today climate models, and you cannot really test their predictions because this is what we want to avoid with the climate models. But then you say, I use the model and say for 1900 in a certain area, so I give it the data from 1900, and then I look, what does the model predict for 1910, 1920, 1930? And then you test the predictions in the sense that these data did not inform the model itself, but you look what the model is doing. Right? And so it doesn't have to be predictions in the future, but it's just, usually people speak that way, that it's consequences of the hypothesis, which you do not plug into it, as data, but you look, what does the theory say about situations which you did not use in the construction of the theory? So this is what he's saying here. And then this is very amazing if you know more philosophy of science, what he's saying there, because that entered mainstream of philosophy of science much later. Only in the 60s and 70s people become aware of what Friedman was amazingly aware of. What he says, if there is one hypothesis consistent with the evidence, there are infinitely many others as well. And this is something sometimes important, sometimes less important, but Friedman saw that extremely clearly. This was already formulated by Pierre Duhem, a very important historian and philosopher of science and physicist. In the beginning of the 20th century, was more or less forgotten in philosophy of science, was not present, but he saw it very clearly. So if you've got one hypothesis that's consistent with the evidence, you can always construct more of them. In fact, infinitely many of them. So which makes it hard, of course, then to choose. Which one shall I choose? And then, of course, the thing is that you say, okay, let's compare these different hypotheses with new evidence. And there, again, he's extremely modern. He says, new evidence may rule out some of the competitors, but can never reduce them to a single one. So whenever you have data, there are always more than one theoretical construction fitting these data. And they're in competition. And if you have to decide with which one shall I work, then he says considerations of simplicity and fruitfulness now may come into play. So you can't, on the basis only of evidence, decide which one is the right hypothesis. Right? And this is really amazing that he had that in complete clarity. This was far ahead from really professional philosophy of science that wasn't discussed at the time. In philosophy of science, this is called the thesis of the underdetermination of a theory by data. And this started with very little beginnings in the 50s and then became in the 60s and 70s. It became well known and part of the mainstream, but Friedman is there aware of it, and I wonder where he got it from. But he's, according to today's standards, he's absolutely right, because whenever you have a finite number of data points, then you can always construct infinitely many hypotheses that fit them. And then you ask what's the simplest one and what's the most fruitful one, and blah, blah, blah. And then all this machinery starts. It's not important for the following, but it's amazing that he knew that already at that time. Okay. Now he says that in the social sciences, the situation is in so far different from the other fields. There are no experiments designed to exclude disturbing influences, controlled experiments. This is the 50s. This is, of course, now dated for economics, behavioral economics. They now have that. That's well established. And he says this was at that time, did not exist. This is these controlled experiments, the RCTs, randomized controlled studies, where you have a group and you have a comparison group, statistically the same, and then you treat this group and don't treat this group, and then you look what are the differences, and then you know that's the difference, that's the effect of the difference in the treatment. So he says we do not have that. That was, of course, well established in biology at that time, and chemistry and other fields. And then he says, but this does not produce a categorical difference between them and the physical sciences, the social science and the physical science, because it's a matter of degree. So he says, yes, we are in a worse situation in the social sciences, but that's not a difference in principle. It's a difference in degree, right? Although we don't have these designed experiments, okay? And first of all, or most importantly, this does not prevent testing of hypotheses by predictions, but the evidence is often more difficult to interpret, and weeding out of unsuccessful hypotheses is slow and difficult. So it's just more complicated in the social sciences, but it's not in principle different from the physical sciences. We are just in a more uncomfortable situation. It's the evidence can be interpreted differently, and this is more leeway concerning the interpretation than in the natural sciences. But again, it's not a matter of principle. Sometimes he claims there are absolutely clear cases, for instance, and this is his prime examples, that the increase in the amount of money lead to an increase of prices, exemplified in all cases of inflation. We'll get articulated a little more carefully. A quick increase in amount of money then leads to increase in prices, exemplified in all cases of inflation. And there he defends apparently the theory that he thinks is the right one, namely that the cause of inflation is increased amount of money, and he therefore says, all these other alternatives that come up when people try to explain inflation, it just doesn't make sense. The real thing is really the increase in the amount of money. That is the prime cause, and that's a case that's very clear, where we have empirical evidence that rules out the alternatives. This is a clear case where we social scientists are on safe ground, similar to the natural sciences. I cannot judge that whether that's appropriate or not, but this is his opinion here, that this is the good examples. And then he says, look, we do have these problems in testing hypotheses, predictions of hypotheses in the social sciences, because these missing strong experiments and only a few really very good clear cases. And that has two effects. It fostered two things: the retreat into formal and tautological analysis, which are important. He doesn't deny that. But economics must be more, it must predict, not only describe the consequences of actions. And that is, of course, this formal and tautological analysis is a conceptual analysis and building models, right? Models just independent of empirical data, or more or less independent of empirical data. And then you play around, and already in the 60s and 70s in German-speaking philosophy, there was this griddle of the model idealism or model Platonism of economists. Hans Albert is one of these guys who's an economist by training and philosopher, and he criticized that, economics is leaving going into these model worlds, and we find that today. Also, we'll see that later in the next chapter. People criticizing those model builders who do not care about empirical data, but they enjoy so much this playful world of models, right, that they don't care. And that is, this is one of these consequences, formal or tautological analysis, and that's certainly not enough. And this is, of course, it must predict, not only describe the consequences of action. This is in accordance with what he said is the goal of economics is, and how the theories have to be tested. And the second one is, and that is now we are coming even more strongly to his central topic, misunderstandings about the role of evidence in theoretical work. He says in theoretical work, evidence does play a role, but people do tend to misunderstand that, and the evidence plays a role, in the construction of hypotheses. So you construct a hypothesis for a certain domain, and the hypothesis must be consistent with existing evidence in order to be focused on the intended set of phenomena. So if you build in economics a hypothesis, you've got to have some idea what the hypothesis is all about. And in order to get this, that it really fits to a certain domain of phenomena, you've got to have data from that phenomena, evidence from that phenomena, and that must somehow lead your construction of that hypothesis. And therefore, you need that in the construction of the hypothesis. But then the hypothesis is only constructed, and the point is then it must be tested, right? Constructing the hypothesis is one thing, but as he said in the beginning, you've got to test. Every hypothesis in economics has to be empirically tested. So you've got to test it, and you test it by novel predictions. So by the predictions that run inbuilt in the hypothesis, but then follow from the hypothesis, and then you can look whether the hypothesis is a good one. So it's the deductions from the hypothesis that leads then to the test. So this is the basic structure, how that has to work. And the evidence plays their role both in the construction and in the testing. By the way, this distinction then, constructing and testing, this is also a Popperian theme, but I'll come back to the Popper influence on this paper. Now, what is the relation between these two, between the construction part and the testing part? Now, first of all, the distribution of facts between them is accidental. And this is what he means. It's just historical coincidence what sort of data you have and on the basis of which you construct a hypothesis. If you had other data, then you would also construct a hypothesis. But which one, if the hypothesis is consistent with all of them, then you could also have used those which are the predictions already in the construction, and those you used for the construction you can use to predict, right? Or you predict them. So the relation, because it's a logical relationship, the hypothesis is just consistent with a set of evidence, with a set of data, and which a subset you use in order to construct the hypothesis, in order to produce, deduce the rest, that's partly accidental. So the generation, and furthermore, the generation of new hypotheses does usually not start from scratch, but is result of a failed test of an earlier hypothesis. So what he's saying is that usually you do not, you don't look at a set of phenomena and say, wow, I've never seen that in my life as an economist, but usually the phenomena are more or less known. You construct a hypothesis, then the hypothesis doesn't work, and then you say, oops, I got to improve it, build in more evidence, other evidence into the hypothesis, different from the one I used before. And the difficulty, this softness or weakness or less missing hardness in the social sciences, that is the difficulty of getting new relevant evidence leads to the temptation to believe in other modes of hypothesis testing. So he thinks, only prediction counts. And he says, but other people do different things because of these difficulties, and especially they think concerning the assumptions in contrast to their consequences. So you do not look after the consequences of the hypothesis, but you look, what are the assumptions in the hypothesis? And then they say, okay, it's so difficult with these data, why don't we test the hypothesis by testing its assumptions? That's the idea. So, and this is now we're coming to this core topic of assumptions. So this is how he describes the economics of his days. We're saying that people try to do that. Examples will follow what he has exactly in mind. And there he thinks this is fundamentally misguided. So he thinks that the test of a hypothesis by testing the assumptions of the hypothesis is principally misguided in economics. The only way is, that is positive message, test the predictions of the hypothesis, not the assumptions. Okay, he will argue for that in detail, but this is the message. You've got to understand the message. So he thinks this is fundamentally misguided, and now comes the sentence that people for the last, 66 years or something, this is the sentence where people say, this Friedman, something is wrong with him. So this is the sentence. Truly important and significant hypothesis will be found to have assumptions. Note the scare quotes, have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. That's the first thing. So truly important, significant hypothesis will found to have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate descriptive representations of reality. So there is something in it which is completely untrue. Right? It's just not describing reality, something else. And in general, and now comes the thing where people say, now he's completely out of his mind. And the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions in this sense. Okay? There are people say, okay, well, perhaps, they have strange assumptions. But then to praise that in the way he does, in general, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions in this sense, they say, no, Friedman, no, I can't swallow that. And no, almost nobody, I think, can swallow that. I think I have not seen an article where someone says, that's right, yes, that's right, right. And also, if you look at that, this is also funny, this little in this sense. I mean, in which sense? Well, in the sense of the scare quotes, right? Assumptions, he puts them in scare quotes, I come back to it. And then he says, what I'm saying here with this outrageous sentence, the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions, but only in that sense with the scare quotes, right? Don't overlook that, please. You don't know what it means, but don't overlook it, right? Okay, so this is the sentence. So what I say is everyone who tries to do something on Friedman must and aims at understanding of Friedman hasn't reached his or her goal if you cannot make sense of this sentence. Usually people then dismiss it. People say, yeah, the first, okay, but the second one is just unacceptable. It's just nonsense, right? My claim is, well, perhaps it's not nonsense, but the only way, if you really want to understand, you've got to understand this sentence. This is, if you don't understand it, you don't understand Friedman. Well, we don't see that here. We'll see later he means that more generally. He thinks that also holds for physics. Okay, we'll see that. I'll come to that. So this is really the point. And as I said, that most people say the more significant, the more unrealistic the assumptions. No, you've got to be joking. That's nonsense. That doesn't function. Okay, let's see. All right. Now, the point is that he's telling us immediately after that sentence, he's explaining that, but people do not really look very carefully at the next sentence. The reason is that reason he gives for that outrageous sentence is this: a good hypothesis explains much by little. Okay? A good hypothesis explains much by little. You have a small little theory and explains many, many different phenomena. It explains much by little. And how does the hypothesis do that? It abstracts the crucial elements from the mass of complex and detailed circumstances. Right? So the hypothesis becomes false because he doesn't care about many, many details and circumstances. Therefore, the hypothesis becomes, literally speaking, false. It must be false because it says only this count and I don't care about the rest. And that's false because the rest is also there. And he says it abstracts the crucial elements. That's the point. So this is what a hypothesis does. It abstracts the crucial element, leaves out the rest, and therefore it's false because the rest is also there, right? Therefore, okay. Now, this is very important, and I've not seen that in any paper I've read. Friedman thus claims a very special kind of falsity of assumptions. He does not say any sort of falsity is wonderful for economics. This is how most people read him. But if you read that sentence immediately afterwards when he says why this is the case, it's a very special kind of falsity of assumptions that are embedded in significant hypotheses, right? It's those false assumptions that are generated by a process of abstraction, okay? We will later see that he's not really sticking to this point, it's changing it, which then adds confusion. But here at least he says, look, it's not just any damn falsity, it's very special kinds of falsities, those that are generated by abstraction. Now, what he says there then, in continuing, why is that so? Not the realism of the realism of the assumptions is important, not whether they are good descriptions of reality. That's not so important. What is much more important, whether they are sufficiently good approximation for the given purpose, right? In a particular situation, for a particular class of problems. This is very important. Friedman is always talking about comparatively small theories, about a certain range of phenomena, not about all phenomena together, but a comparatively small domain, and therefore these phenomena, for the given purpose, these abstractions must be sufficiently good approximations. And then the question is, how can you find out whether they are sufficiently good approximations? This can only be found out by their predictions. Right? So he says, in these good hypotheses, you have these false assumptions. It's a very special kind of falsity. It's a falsity that is generated because I abstract from many factors which I think are not relevant. Then I end up with a hypothesis that's literally speaking false as a description of the phenomenon. And when I say, how can I defend that falsity? Then because I say, look, it's an approximation to the real situation. How can you find out that it's a good approximation? By the predictions you are getting. Right? So the falsity, the specific falsities are then justified by their power of generating prediction. And the falsity is a falsity that, because you want to explain much by little, as he said, a good hypothesis explains much by little, therefore you abstract, and then you control the abstraction whether it leads to good predictions, which then shows that the sort of abstractions that you did was a good abstraction for the purpose at hand. For the next problem, it may be a bad abstraction, but for those problems for which you did it, it was a good abstraction. So what he's saying then is the two supposedly independent tests thus reduce to one test. And this is the independent test, meaning that people believe, okay, you've got an economic hypothesis, and then you can test it by testing its assumptions. You look, how good are these assumptions here, and you test the assumptions, and that's something different, you believe, or some people may believe, from testing the predictions. But what Friedman says is, no, that's not the case. You cannot test the assumptions that are built into assumptions, with scare quotes. You cannot test these assumptions or that are inbuilt into a hypothesis separately from prediction. There's only one sort of test, that's prediction. Right? This is what he claims. Also, that may or may not be plausible to you. I'm going to explain to you what he's really meaning here. But this is his thesis. So he says, this is what he says in the paper, and also there are people, well, possibly don't understand what was going on. So this is what he's saying. This is a literal quote. Two supposedly independent tests, namely prediction or test of assumptions, reduced to one test. There's just no possibility of testing the assumptions independently. This is what he's claiming. Let's see whether he's right. Now, here are the examples by which he tries to explain to us this perhaps somewhat strange statement about methodology. So he says that the theory of monopolistic and imperfect competition, that was a theory that was apparently developed there in the 50s. I can't tell you more about it. The theory, but it's enough in the context that you see what he means. The theory of monopolistic and imperfect competition was motivated by the perceived descriptive inaccuracy of neoclassical assumptions of perfect competition and perfect monopoly, and not motivated by failing predictions. So he says this theory about, of something which is different from perfect competition or perfect monopoly, that was developed because people thought, wow, these theories cannot be very good, because in reality we do not have perfect competition, right? We do not have perfect monopoly, so they developed theories that try to build in more realistic assumptions into their theories, right? This is what he's saying. And what he's claiming here is that these theories were not developed because the predictions were so bad, but that people said, look, their assumptions are not true, therefore we need an alternative, right? And this is what he's going to criticize. We'll see that in a moment. And the same holds here. Discussion on marginal analysis concentrated on the largely irrelevant, he claims, question of whether businessmen in fact reach their decisions by marginal analysis, and not on the conformity to experience of the consequences of marginal analysis. So what he's saying, what happens here, and he describes it at other parts of the essay as well, that people try to empirically determine how to managers come to their decisions, right? And they ask them, and what are you doing, and how are you calculating, and do you trust your tummy, or what are you doing, right? And he says this is, of course, motivated not by the failing predictions of the alternative neoclassical theory, but because people thought, well, the assumptions that these managers really determine by calculation, the marginal, whatever it is, marginal return, what they're getting, therefore they thought we make the theory more realistic and therefore better. And this is what Friedman criticizes. He says that's the wrong approach in economics, right? And this is, of course, surprising, because that's quite plausible when you say you have a theory here and the assumptions are very inaccurate or unrealistic, that you say if you want to improve the theory, then improve these assumptions that you put in there. And there is where Milton Friedman protests. And we should see what the arguments are that he has here. So these are the examples where people think they can test or then improve theories by changing the assumptions, by testing the assumptions or changing the assumptions. And Friedman says that's wrong. That doesn't really work. Right? So we'll see why he's saying that. And these two examples exemplify the use of counterfactual assumptions in economic theory. You see here the counterfactual assumptions is, of course, perfect competition and perfect monopoly, or it's here marginal analysis, which is a counterfactual assumptions concerning the thinking processes of managers. And he says, look, but the better theoretical reasoning is using these counterfactual assumptions, and you can typically not improve theory by improving upon these assumptions. This may be very strange, but let's see how he's arguing. Okay? So these two examples exemplify the use of counterfactual assumptions in economic theory. And I will discuss the specific kind of counterfactuality equal to falseness or unrealisticness later, right, in section 3.3. But this is his point, and don't judge it prematurely. It's a question, what are the arguments of Friedman for arguing in that way? He knows that most people will disagree with him, but he's got arguments, and one should see the arguments first. And therefore, this is the fundamental point that will come. I'll come back to that also again. Economic theory should not be criticized for its deployment of such assumptions. Counterfactual, idealizing assumptions. What really counts is whether from such assumptions empirically correct implications follow. This is his message. So if you think you have an additional path to the testing by predictions, an additional path at a critique of economic theory by looking at the assumptions and look, are they realistic or not, then Friedman says, no, this is not an additional path. This is methodologically a wrong approach, what you're doing. So let's see how he's going to argue for that more. All right. So for him, it's so that the only test that's available is whether from such assumption empirically correct implications follow or not. That is for him the only test, right? And this, people understand it a certain way. And this justifies now a more extensive discussion of the methodological principle involved, and this is going to happen in the next section. So he first lays out this principal area of methodological theorizing, how people react, that people think they have two ways of testing economic theory by testing assumptions, testing predictions. He claims that's not right. There's only one test because you can't test the assumptions in that sense, whatever that is. You can only test predictions, right? And the assumptions are false because they are abstractions. This is how he describes it. In parentheses, this is not completely correct. We'll see later. He's not correct himself about himself. We'll see it later. Anyway, so this, in any case, this justified a more extensive discussion of the methodological principles involved, and that happens in the next section, in which he now brings up this topic again, right, which was only now announced, so to speak.